Look at the people around you and try harder. That's what my CEO said before she called me a failure, in front of 600 people. And then she handed a check for $400,000 to a guy who'd been here less than a year. That's the part you'd think would hurt the most. It didn't. What hit me was the number. But let me back up. My name is Delphine Carter. I've worked operations in Chicago logistics for 15 years. Same company, same building near LaSalle. I built the systems nobody notices until they break. The gala was loud, cheap champagne smell, and the hum of too many conversations stacked on top of each other. Victoria Hale stood under the lights like she owned gravity. And tonight, she said, smiling wide, we reward bold transformation. She called up Trevor, Vice President of Strategy, 11 months in the company, smart, polished, talks fast, slides always glossy. She handed him a framed certificate and said, for driving strategic innovation, we are awarding a retention bonus of $400,000. Applause, whistles. Then she looked straight at me. Look at the people around you and try harder. 15 years in operations and still protecting old systems. That's what failure looks like in a new era. I swear I heard a fork drop somewhere behind me. You ever have a room go quiet but somehow louder at the same time? I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. Because that $400,000 was just the tip of the iceberg. It was the entry point to reclassify the entire $7 million risk mitigation reserve. She used Trevor's bonus as a legal precedent to unlock the whole fund for strategic use. That's what killed the ratio. Trevor shook my hand later. No hard feelings. Delphine, we're just moving fast. Yeah, I said fast. Honestly, I almost convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was becoming exactly what she said. That night, I opened the draft quarterly packet at my kitchen table. The radiator was clanking like it always does when it shouldn't. The bonus wasn't listed as a bonus. It was under strategic cost realignment, and it was booked against third quarter. Third quarter wasn't closed yet. I stared at the timing adjustment. Just a line. Just a shift. By booking the bonus against the unclosed third quarter, she was burying the expense now to clear the decks. It made this quarter look heavy, but it ensured the next one, the one investors would see during the roadshow, would look artificially lean and profitable. I closed the laptop. Sat there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. Either way, I wasn't going to sleep. The next morning, Victoria emailed me at 7:12. Come by my office. Quick alignment. Quick alignment is corporate for brace yourself. Her office overlooks the river. But she didn't offer me the chair by the window. I sat across from her desk instead. She folded her hands like we were about to discuss a charity gala. Delphine, you're competent, she began. But you're not agile. You protect systems. I build growth. I protect the company from breaking, I answered. She smiled like that was cute. We can't run a 2024 business with 2015 caution. Caution kept us solvent in 2018. That was then. She leaned forward. Investors reward boldness. The reserve was underutilized. We redirected it strategically. $400,000 is not redirection. I replied, it's exposure. It's retention. It's tied to a covenant threshold. We're within range. For now. She tapped her pen once. You see risk everywhere. It's my job. Not anymore. Her voice softened. We're restructuring. Finance oversight will be centralized. You'll focus on operational execution. So I lose discretionary classification review. You gain clarity. Put that in writing. I said. She paused. That was the first real shift. You don't trust me, I trust documentation. A long look. Then she nodded. Fine. I'll send confirmation. When I stepped out, I ran into Martin from finance in the hallway. You okay? He muttered. Did the audit committee approve the reclassification language? He hesitated. Interim chair signed off. Didn't dig deep. Of course he didn't. By noon, Victoria's email arrived. My oversight scope formally reduced. Clean language. Strategic tone. I archived it. Then I opened the consulting agreement tied to the so-called innovation savings. The firm address listed Naperville. The managing partner's name looked familiar. Same last name as Victoria's brother-in-law. I stared at it longer than I should have. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe I was paranoid. But I printed the contract anyway. I didn't sleep much that week. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I was just bitter. Maybe I was turning into the exact dinosaur she painted me as. So I did what I always do when I don't trust my emotions. I ran numbers. I pulled comparable consulting contracts from 3 similar logistics firms in the Midwest. Same size, same service scope. Their median advisory fee sat almost 40% lower than ours, 38% above industry range. No bid documentation in our system. Payment schedule aligned exactly with the reserve transfer date. I walked into Martin's office with a printout. Did we issue an RFP for the innovation consulting contract? He didn't look up at first. Strategy handled that, so no RFP. He exhaled, not formally. And you signed off on the payment structure. I signed off on the classification, which reduced our reserve. We're still compliant? Barely. He rubbed his forehead. It hasn't breached. It's 0.3 below comfort threshold. Delphine. That's not a breach. It's closer than disclosed. Silence. If the bank flags that drop, I continued. We trigger enhanced reporting. If external auditors question intent, it's not just optics anymore. Martin leaned back. You're assuming intent. I'm looking at timing. I went back to my office and drafted a memo. Clean. No accusation. Just exposure mapping, reserve ratio shift, covenant sensitivity, related party disclosure review recommended. I sent it to Victoria, Martin, and copied the interim audit chair. Within 10 minutes, I got a reply. Received. We are aligned on growth strategy. Victoria. That was it. No discussion. No meeting. A week later, an all-staff email went out. Operational streamlining initiative. Under the new structure, discretionary financial classifications would route through executive strategy. My name wasn't anywhere near that flow anymore. Martin stopped by my desk later. This isn't personal, he muttered. Then it's structural. I told him, and that was worse. I didn't wait for the restructuring memo to turn into a quiet demotion. I walked into Victoria's office with a single page. I'm resigning. I told her. She leaned back, almost amused. You're making this dramatic. I'm making it clean. You don't have another offer? I'll figure it out. She studied me for a second. Chicago doesn't need cautious operators. You'll be back? Maybe. I replied, but not like this. She didn't try to stop me. That told me more than anything else. I handled transition the way I always handled operations. Precise. Boring. Complete. Every file documented. Every vendor contact transferred. No locked folders. No deleted emails. If something collapsed, it wouldn't be because I sabotaged it. Before my last day, I sent one final internal memo. Subject contract X risk projection. The freight automation deal included penalty triggers if throughput fell below threshold. I outlined the exposure clearly. Martin called me after reading it. You're covering yourself? I'm covering the company. Same thing. Not anymore. 3 months later, Contract X triggered penalties exactly as modeled. The announcement was buried in the earnings supplement. Share price slid 11% over 2 days. I was in a rented office in River North when the alert hit my phone. The place smelled faintly like burnt coffee from the shared kitchen. I didn't feel vindicated, just tired. A week later, an analyst report circulated. Reserve reallocation lacks transparency. Governance review recommended. Victoria was the one facing questions now, and she didn't have me in the room to answer them. The first call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Delphine Carter. The voice was older, measured. Yes, this is Howard Klein. I hold a little under 2%. I used to run freight corridors in the 80s. Your reporting used to make sense. Now the reserve line item doesn't reconcile. I leaned back in my chair. What part doesn't reconcile the movement between quarters? It's cleaner than it should be. Cleaner how too smooth. That hit. I don't work there anymore. I told him. I know, that's why I'm calling you. Within a week, 2 small institutional holders requested a call. Different tones. Same discomfort. Our models flagged the reserve shift. One of them told me. We're down 17% across 2 quarters. The bank's requesting enhanced disclosure. And insurance, I asked. They want clarification on risk allocation. This wasn't nostalgia. It was exposure. Howard spoke again on the group call. We're not looking to reinstall you. We want clarity. I'm not seeking employment. I said, only transparency. Silence. Then would you represent us by proxy at the annual meeting? I felt my chest tighten. How much combined? Just under 9%? That's not enough to move anything. We're talking to a Midwest fund. They're reviewing governance. 3 days later, that fund joined. The number rose to 12.4%. Legal counsel drafted the proxy documents. Clean, procedural. I nearly backed out. Then an email came from Jenna, former analyst, laid off during cost realignment. I thought the reserve was for stability. I stared at that sentence for a long time. I signed the proxy agreement. 2 days later, shareholder counsel filed a formal request under Bylaw Section 8.4 for independent audit review of reserve allocation and related party transactions. The board would have to respond, and once it was public, there was no stepping back into the quiet. The proxy paperwork moved fast once it was filed. Shareholder counsel sent formal notice to the board demanding independent review under Bylaw Section 8.4. With more than 10% combined authority, they couldn't ignore it. 3 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Delphine. The voice sounded thinner than I remembered. Trevor? He exhaled sharply. Yeah, listen. I retained counsel. I figured, they're looking at internal communications. They should silence. My attorney thinks I need to cooperate. He continued. There's an email. What email he swallowed? I could hear it through the line. Victoria wrote, adjust classification for optics. Reserve won't be scrutinized. It was in response to my concern about timing. I closed my eyes. You didn't think that mattered? I thought she meant presentation. He shot back. I didn't understand covenant implications. You're a vice president. I'm not a compliance officer. That was the first honest thing he'd said. My lawyer says if there's intentional reclassification and I signed off, I'm exposed. You are. I answered quietly. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. He added, I just didn't think it through. Ambition moves fast. I said, liability moves slower. He let out a hollow laugh. My attorney will provide the email to the independent reviewers. Good. This wasn't confession. It was survival. The email didn't prove embezzlement. It didn't prove theft, but it showed intent to adjust reporting optics before quarter close. That's not criminal. It is dangerous. 2 days later, shareholder counsel forwarded a preliminary advisory memo to the board outlining potential fiduciary exposure if misclassification was substantiated. From that moment on, this wasn't about me. It was about whether directors would defend leadership or protect themselves. The annual meeting was held in a rented hall inside the Chicago Board of Trade building. I could smell old carpet and coffee that had been sitting too long. Victoria stood at the podium like nothing had shifted. Midwest expansion corridor growth remained strong. She began, technology integration continues ahead of schedule. This is transformation acceleration. The slides moved fast, clean charts, polished phrases. Applause came, but it was thin, scattered. I sat in the fourth row with a folder on my lap. No grand entrance, no dramatic reveal. Just 12.4% of voting authority in writing. The corporate secretary stepped up after Victoria finished. We will now hear from shareholder proxy representative, Ms. Delphine Carter. My name landed heavier than I expected. Victoria's posture changed, just slightly. Her smile tightened. I walked to the microphone. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. Victoria leaned toward the board chair and whispered something. He nodded but didn't look comfortable. I adjusted the microphone. I'm here representing shareholders holding 12.4% of voting authority. I began. Under Bylaw Section 8.4, we are formally requesting independent audit review of reserve allocation and related party consulting agreements. Murmurs rippled. Victoria straightened. That request is unnecessary. It's procedural. I replied, not personal. I opened the folder. I wasn't carrying accusations, just documentation. And for the first time since that gala, I felt steady. I adjusted the microphone and kept my voice even. Over the past 6 months, I began. There were 3 governance changes directly affecting reserve oversight. I laid them out one by one. First, Discretionary reclassification authority shifted to executive strategy. Second, the audit committee chair retired and was replaced without financial specialization. Third, the risk mitigation reserve was reallocated under strategic retention. Victoria crossed her arms. This is selective framing. She cut in. You're presenting internal strategy as misconduct. I'm presenting timing, I replied. The reserve ratio declined 0.3 below covenant comfort threshold after reclassification. We remain compliant, she snapped. For now. The board chair leaned forward. Ms. Carter, are you alleging wrongdoing? I'm requesting independent review under Bylaw Section 8.4. Victoria's tone sharpened. A shareholder inquiry is one thing, but an independent audit is a disruption of business operations. You're overstepping the intent of Bylaw 8.4. The corporate secretary cleared his throat. The reclassification dropped our debt service coverage ratio, DSCR, to 1.18. The bank covenant requires a minimum of 1.25. We aren't just close to a breach. Victoria, we are in technical default, and the bank has the right to freeze our credit lines tomorrow. The air shifted. One director, Frank Dougherty, longtime ally of Victoria, spoke up. This feels retaliatory. Former employee dissatisfaction doesn't constitute material concern. I'm not a former employee in this context. I said, I'm a shareholder representative. Another director stayed silent, staring at the table. I continued. There's also a related party consulting agreement exceeding market median by 38%, executed without formal bidding. That agreement was strategic. Victoria replied, and documented in an email instructing classification adjustment for optics. I added, that landed. Victoria turned toward me slowly. You're misinterpreting language. I'm quoting it. Frank shook his head. Even if the wording was careless, that doesn't imply fiduciary breach. The independent director, Karen Liu, finally spoke. If intentional misclassification occurred, even for presentation purposes, fiduciary exposure extends to this board. Silence followed. Victoria looked at her. You're overreacting. Karen didn't flinch. I'm assessing risk outside counsel, seated near the end of the table, leaned toward the chair. Given the documented proxy threshold and potential covenant implications, an independent audit review would mitigate board liability. Victoria stared at him. You're advising against management? I'm advising protection of fiduciary duty. That was the moment power shifted. Not to me. Away from her. The board chair exhaled slowly. We'll call for a vote on initiating independent audit review limited to reserve allocation and related party transactions. Victoria's jaw tightened. This is unnecessary escalation. It's procedure. Karen replied. Hands rose one by one. Frank voted against. 2 abstained. The rest approved. The chair spoke formally. Independent audit review is authorized. Pending review. Discretionary financial classification authority transfers to the audit committee. Victoria blinked once. Then again, no removal. The chair added quickly. This is containment. Not condemnation. No applause, no gasps. Just paper shuffling and the low hum of people recalibrating. Victoria leaned toward the microphone one last time. Her voice had lost its polish. That's impossible. Not angry, not loud, just stunned. I didn't respond. Because what she meant wasn't that the vote couldn't happen. She meant I couldn't understand the system well enough to force it. The room settled back into order. But the hierarchy felt different now. No one had been fired. No one had been dragged out. But authority had moved. And it hadn't moved in her direction. The headline hit 2 days later. Chicago logistics firm initiates independent governance review. No scandal language, no drama, just clean corporate phrasing. Victoria remained CEO. But her discretionary classification authority shifted to the audit committee pending findings. That detail mattered more than any headline. I got a call from the board chair that afternoon. Delphine. We'd like to speak privately. I met them in a small conference room. No cameras, no assistants. We're evaluating restructuring options. He began. Would you consider stepping in on an interim basis? As CEO, I asked. As transitional leadership? Victoria wasn't in the room. I don't want the chair, I replied. Karen Liu studied me. You've already demonstrated capability. I protect systems, I told her. I don't run narratives. The chair leaned forward. then serve as external advisor. 6 months. Independent contract. That works. It wasn't triumph, it was containment. Trevor texted me that night. My attorney says cooperation helped. Good. I wrote back. The audit team moved in quietly. Data requests, email pulls, timeline reconstructions. No one shouted. No one stormed out. For the first time in a year, I slept without replaying the word failure in my head. It didn't disappear. It just stopped owning space. 6 months into the audit, the findings came back controlled but clear. Improper classification language, governance weakness, required corrective measures, no fraud charges, no dramatic collapse, just accountability. Victoria called me once after the report finalized. You pushed this too far, she told me. I followed the bylaws. I answered. You embarrassed the company. I protected it. Silence. Then softer. You could have taken my seat. I didn't want it. She hung up first. The board completed restructuring quietly. I fulfilled my 6-month advisory contract and stepped away. No farewell party, no speech. 1 year earlier, she had called me a failure in front of 600 people. At the meeting, when the vote passed, her last word was different. That's impossible. It wasn't revenge, it was governance. I learned something I didn't expect. Stability looks boring until it's gone. Documentation feels petty until it saves you, and titles don't equal power structure does. If this story hit you in any way, hit like. Drop a comment. Tell me where you've been underestimated. I read them. I didn't win because she lost. I won because I stopped needing her scale to measure me. And I'm still deciding what I build next. The wine was cold. It struck my forehead first, then slid down the side of my face and into the collar of my jacket before I fully processed what had happened. For a second, no one moved. Then I heard her voice clearly. Know your place? Victoria Whitlock was still holding the empty glass when I looked up at her. The overhead lights caught the red stain spreading across the white tablecloth in front of me. Around us. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor. A few phones were already raised. No one spoke. I did not stand. I did not answer her. I reached for a linen napkin and pressed it against my cheek. For a brief second, I considered standing up. Not to argue, just to leave. I didn't, but the thought was there. I have learned that the first reaction in a public room often determines who controls it. She believed she had taken control. I understood something else had just shifted. My name is Lysandra Cole Barrett. I am 53 years old. I was invited to the gala because part of my work requires observing people when they are not expecting to be evaluated. The ballroom at the Fairmont in San Francisco was full of executives, military officials, and investors. Whitlock Dynamics needed the upcoming unmanned aerial vehicle contract to steady a company that had already lost 2 major bids that year. Everyone in that room knew what was at stake, even if they pretended the evening was only about charity. Victoria leaned slightly toward me, close enough that I could smell the wine on her breath. You don't belong here, she said. Lower now, but still loud enough for the table to hear. I held her gaze and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. I could feel the heat rising in my face, and I hated that it still happened to me. I thought I had grown past being reduced in a room. Security began moving in our direction. I lifted a hand to signal them to stop. This was not a security issue. It was a character issue. Across the table, and one of the procurement officers avoided my eyes. Another looked directly at Victoria, as if committing the moment to memory. I did the same. I had a meeting at 2 o'clock the next afternoon in Arlington, Virginia. The contract under review was worth $1.2 billion. That decision had been forming for months. What happened in that ballroom would not create it, but it would clarify it. As the silence settled back into conversation, I sat there with wine drying against my skin and understood that the most important part of the evening had just begun. 12 hours before the wine, I was sitting in a quiet hotel suite with a briefing folder open on the desk. Whitlock Dynamics was one of 3 finalists for the autonomous unmanned aerial vehicle program valued at $1.2 billion. On paper, their engineering metrics were solid. Their delivery timeline was competitive, boss. But numbers only tell part of the story. Earlier that week, one of my analysts, Daniel Ruiz, had looked across the conference table at me and said, technically, they qualify. Culturally, I'm not convinced. Daniel slid another folder toward me. There was an internal memo last year, he said. One board member warned about executive conduct during vendor negotiations. It was dismissed. Dismissed how I asked. They called it personality friction. I closed the file. People call it personality until someone writes a check. Based on what I asked, turnover at senior levels, 2 discrimination complaints settled quietly. Leadership optics. He hesitated. And the volatility. Their stock had swung unpredictably for 6 straight months after losing 2 major bids. Investors were restless. The board was under pressure. At the gala reception that afternoon, James Whitlock approached me near the entrance. "Director Barrett," he said, offering a firm handshake, "we're confident you'll find our proposal speaks for itself." "I have read it," I replied. "Tonight isn't about the proposal." He paused. "Then what is it about consistency?" I said. "How a company behaves when it isn't presenting slides." He smiled, but it tightened at the corners. "We run a disciplined organization." "I'll be observing," I answered. He lowered his voice slightly. "We need this contract. I'm aware." There it was. Not desperation. Exactly, but strain. By the time I took my seat at table 12, I understood something important. Whitlock Dynamics wasn't stable. They were balancing. And companies that are balancing can tip faster than they expect. I had seen Victoria Whitlock's name in reports long before I met her. She wasn't an executive on paper, but she carried influence inside the company. That kind of influence rarely shows up in organizational charts. During the reception, she moved through the room as if she were inspecting it. When a server refilled her glass without being asked, she said, "Not so much. I don't need it sloshing." Her tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to change the air around her. Later, a young engineer tried to introduce himself. "Mrs. Whitlock, I'm leading the propulsion redesign on the Falcon series." She looked at his badge before answering. "Are you?" Then she turned slightly towards someone else. "Ambition is admirable." He stepped back. I watched the exchange without interrupting. It wasn't my role to correct her, like it was my role to notice. I knew her background. Her father-in-law had built missile guidance systems in the 1980s. The Whitlock name had been tied to defense contracts for decades. Legacy can become a shield, and sometimes a burden. I overheard part of a conversation near the bar. "If we lose this one, the board won't protect anyone," Victoria said quietly. Her voice didn't sound arrogant then. It sounded cornered. She had never learned how to exist without being the Whitlock name in the room. James replied, "Then don't make it harder. I'm trying to protect what's ours," she said. At one point, she joined a conversation near our table and said, "This industry used to be about discipline. Now it's about optics." She didn't look at me directly when she said it, but she knew I was there. One of the procurement officers replied, "Standards evolve." She smiled tightly. "Some standards shouldn't." I could sense something underneath the posture. Whitlock Dynamics had lost 2 bids that year. Investors were impatient. When companies weaken, internal hierarchies feel threatened. People start protecting territory. When Colonel Hastings greeted me with, "Director Barrett, good to see you again," I saw Victoria register it. Respect given publicly can unsettle someone who believes respect belongs to them by default. She stepped closer to our table after that. "I don't recognize you," she said to me. "That's fine," I answered. Recognition and authority are not the same thing. Dinner had just been served when Victoria returned to our table. I was seated between Colonel Hastings and Elaine Porter from procurement. We were discussing supply chain resilience when Hastings said, "Director Barrett, we'll need your final recommendation by Thursday." Victoria stopped behind him. Director Hastings turned slightly. "Mrs. Whitlock." She smiled, but it was measured. "I wasn't aware we had additional directors in attendance." Elaine replied evenly. "Several." Victoria's eyes moved to me. "And you are with which firm?" "I'm not with a firm." I said, "Consulting." "Then no." She waited for more. "I didn't provide it." Hastings cleared his throat. "We were discussing the upcoming evaluation." Victoria rested her hand on the back of a chair. "Evaluation of what?" "Exactly," Elaine answered. "Autonomous systems." Victoria nodded slowly. "Well, Whitlock Dynamics has led this sector for decades. We don't need evaluation from outsiders who don't understand our legacy." I met her gaze. "Legacy is one metric. And what are the others?" she asked. "Performance, stability, leadership conduct." Her jaw tightened. "Leadership conduct?" "Yes." She leaned slightly closer. "You're implying something I'm observing," I said. She glanced at Hastings. Since when does the department send observers to charity events? Hastings replied. We attend many events. She shifted her focus back to me. You haven't answered my question. I don't need to. The table fell quiet for a moment. Conversations around us continued, but I could feel attention turning. Victoria straightened. I find it inappropriate that someone without visible credentials is seated at this table. Elaine's voice cooled. Credentials are verified before invitations are issued. Victoria's tone sharpened. By whom? By those responsible. I said. There was a flicker in her expression then. Not confusion. Resistance. She spoke louder. Some seats are earned. I answered calmly. Agreed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It felt like the space before something irreversible. Victoria lifted her wine glass slowly, as if reaching a decision. The wine fell in a clean arc. It landed on my hair, my jacket, the table. No one laughed. No one intervened. Victoria lowered the empty glass and said, Now we understand each other. I held her eyes and said nothing. Security stepped closer. I lifted my hand. Stand down. They stopped. James Whitlock appeared within seconds. Victoria, he said quietly, what are you doing? Correcting an error, she replied. This isn't the place, he said. It's exactly the place. Phones were visible everywhere now. Someone near the stage whispered, This is bad. Victoria looked around the room. If people don't belong, they don't belong. James turned to me. Director Barrett, I apologize. I'll see you tomorrow, I said. That was all. By the time I reached my hotel, the video was circulating. Daniel Ruiz called before midnight. It's everywhere, but he said, #Winegate is trending. I assumed it would. I answered. She posted a statement. What does it say? That she stands by her defense of merit. I closed my laptop, noted. I thought about my father that night. He used to say that if you have to demand respect in public, you've already lost it in private. By morning, Whitlock Dynamics was down 7% in pre-market trading. Analysts were already linking reputational risk to contract uncertainty. James called once. We can address this, he said. You can address what happened. I replied. The evaluation continues. She didn't know who you were. That's not the issue. Silence filled the line. He understood that. Public embarrassment is one thing. Market response is another. James Whitlock entered the conference room at 2 o'clock sharp. He looked composed, but the strain showed around his eyes. He stopped briefly when he saw me seated at the head of the table. Director Barrett, he said, I appreciate you seeing me. Please sit down, I replied. Around the table were 2 procurement officers, legal counsel, and a representative from oversight. No one wasted time. James folded his hands. Before we begin, I want to address last night. My wife acted inappropriately. I nodded. This meeting is about your company. He hesitated. You served in uniform, correct, for 22 years, I said. Then I transitioned into this role. I respect that, he replied. Respect is demonstrated in conduct. I answered. We reviewed the proposal for the autonomous systems program valued at $1.2 billion. Technical performance metrics were strong. Cost projections were acceptable. Then I shifted the discussion. Our evaluation framework now includes cultural assessment. James exhaled slowly. We build aircraft. Director, we don't host seminars. You build systems that operate in contested environments. I said, leadership culture affects reliability. He leaned forward. Are you telling me a social incident determines the outcome of a defense contract? No. I said, I'm telling you it confirms existing concerns. He looked at the others. Concerns about what? Employee turnover, internal complaints, the way authority is exercised. Silence settled over the table. James pressed his fingers together. My father built this company from a warehouse in 1983. I let that sit for a moment. And you're about to dismantle it, he asked. For the first time, his voice wasn't defensive. It sounded tired. No, I said. Your leadership choices are, I continued evenly. The contract has been awarded to Northrop Grumman as of this morning. For a moment, I wondered if there had been a version of this outcome where no one had to fall. James blinked once. You finalized it already? Yes. This was our strongest bid in years. I'm aware. He lowered his voice. You're punishing us. I'm applying standards. He met my eyes. Over one mistake last night wasn't about a glass of wine, I said. It was about what your company tolerates when it thinks no one important is watching. He sat back, the shift visible. There is no appeal, he asked. You can compete again, I replied. But cultural integrity is not negotiable. The meeting ended without raised voices. The contract decision was public within 48 hours. Whitlock Dynamics issued a brief statement congratulating the winning bidder. It was professional and restrained. The market was not. Daniel called me that Friday. They're down another 9% today. Total, I asked. 18% over 2 weeks. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Expected 2 days later, a procurement liaison forwarded a notice. Boeing had paused subcontract discussions with Whitlock pending internal review. James requested a call. This is spreading, he said. His voice sounded thinner than it had at the gala. Boeing is reconsidering. Smaller suppliers are hesitating. Confidence reacts to instability. I replied, this is reputational contagion. He said, it's cumulative exposure. I answered. He was quiet for a moment. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission reopened an inquiry from 2 years ago. I saw the filing. It was settled for $200,000. He said quickly, no admission of wrongdoing. Settlements don't erase patterns. I replied, that same week, a former mid-level manager appeared in an online interview. She described internal complaints that never reached the board. The clip circulated widely. Daniel sent me the link. This isn't about the gala anymore. It never was, I said. At the next oversight meeting, one of the compliance officers summarized it plainly. The incident accelerated scrutiny. It didn't create it. Nothing collapses in one night. It just becomes visible. People usually see it long before they admit it. James sent one final message through official channels. We're restructuring leadership. That's appropriate, I responded. Corporate decline rarely looks dramatic from the inside. It looks procedural. Calls, reviews, paused contracts, gradual withdrawal of trust. I wasn't in the San Jose boardroom, but I received the official summary the same evening. Emergency session, full attendance, legal counsel present. James called afterward, but his tone controlled. They voted, he said. I assumed they would. I replied, Victoria has been removed from her advisory role, effective immediately. I didn't answer right away. They froze her trust distributions, he continued. Pending internal review. That's a board decision, I said. It was unanimous. I could hear movement on his end, as if he had stepped away from others to make the call. My father spoke before the vote. He said quietly, what did he say? James paused. He said, this didn't start last night. That sentence carried more weight than the rest. And you, I asked? I filed for separation this afternoon. He said, it will be public by the end of the week. I defended her for years, he said quietly. I told the board she was misunderstood. I didn't respond. Maybe I misunderstood, he added. Or maybe I didn't want to see it, he said. She's been speaking that way for years, he added. I told myself it wasn't a problem. That's personal, I said. It's structural, he corrected. The company can't stabilize if leadership appears divided. There it was, not anger, not grief, calculation. Are you satisfied, he asked. This isn't about satisfaction, I replied. I'm trying to save what's left. Then focus on reform. I said, not optics. He exhaled slowly. Understood. 2 weeks after the board vote, we formalized the updated evaluation framework. Cultural assessment would now carry weighted scoring equal to technical performance in contracts above $1 billion. Daniel reviewed the draft memo before it circulated. This will upset half the industry, he said. It already has, I replied. They'll say it's political. They said that before. He leaned back in his chair. Are you prepared for that? I don't need to be prepared. I said, it's policy. Press inquiries began almost immediately. A communications officer forwarded several requests. One network wants you live tonight, she said. They're framing it as retaliation. I won't be participating. I answered, they'll assume silence means guilt. Silence means procedure. Later that afternoon, a representative from another federal agency joined a coordination call. We're reviewing your scoring model, she said. It may be adaptable. It's built on documented indicators. I replied, retention, complaint history. Leadership accountability. Some contractors will push back. They can. I said, standards aren't optional. I was asked again whether the Whitlock incident influenced the change. It accelerated visibility. I said, it didn't create the need. The framework wasn't about Victoria. It was about preventing environments where conduct like that could be dismissed as personality. Daniel looked at me once after the call ended. You could have made this personal. I didn't. I said, if you had authority to change one broken system, would you 1 year later? I walked back into the same ballroom at the Fairmont in San Francisco. The layout was nearly identical. Different guests, same polished routine. Whitlock Dynamics was still operating. Smaller, leaner. Their new executive roster had been announced 3 months earlier, including 2 leaders recruited from outside the company. Daniel forwarded me the update when it became public. They're serious about restructuring, he said. They have to be, I replied. James requested a brief meeting before the reception began. He looked older, though not defeated. We've implemented everything, he said. External audits, leadership training, independent oversight. I've reviewed the documentation. I answered, you'll judge us fairly, I always do. He nodded once. Victoria moved to Oakland. She's not involved in the company anymore. I didn't comment. That part no longer concerned me professionally. When the evening started, I took my assigned seat and scanned the room. Conversation was measured. Introductions were careful. People were watching themselves more closely now. As I passed table 12 later that night, I paused for a moment, not because I felt vindicated, but because I understood something more clearly than I had a year ago. Authority doesn't protect you from consequences. It exposes you to them. If there is anything I would tell you after living through this, it's simple. I used to think composure was strength. That's something you believe when you're younger. Now I know accountability is heavier and harder. Pride isolates. Standards endure. Share your thoughts. Conversations about accountability matter more than any contract. Empires rarely fall because of one glass of wine. They fall because of what that glass reveals. By 6 o'clock that morning, the merger was already unraveling. At 5:17, the escrow agent had issued a formal suspension notice. By the time I refreshed the market screen, the buyer had invoked the walkaway clause. Around 5:30 the evening before, the CEO's wife slapped me at the gala, and I did not react. Her husband had me escorted out and fired on the spot. By morning, the $2.4 billion had not cleared, and the buyer had pulled out before it ever could. My name is Lillian Hartwell. I was the lead systems architect for a Boston fintech firm in the middle of a high-profile acquisition. When I sat at my kitchen table in Cambridge that morning, still wearing the black jacket from the night before, I understood the suspension notice for what it was. I had helped write the operational continuity protocol myself. The merger was structured in 3 parts: $1.9 billion in acquisition payment, $300 million tied to performance milestones, and $200 million was placed in a closing holdback escrow, gated by a 48-hour technical validation period. During that period, the core transaction engine had to run without interruption, and designated technical signatories had to provide time-stamped release attestations at scheduled checkpoints. I was one of those signatories. The night before, at a private event space in the Seaport District, the company was celebrating as if the deal were already complete. The harbor lights were visible through the glass. Though I barely looked up from my tablet, we were still inside the validation window. I remember thinking that celebrations often start before the work is finished. That was the atmosphere when Isabella Hartwell approached me, and everything shifted. Everything. The venue in the Seaport was all glass and polished floors, built to impress investors who liked clean lines and clear views. I stayed near the edge with my tablet because the command room was 1 floor down and during validation. I was on call for every checkpoint. We were still inside the 48-hour validation window, and that mattered more than the champagne circulating behind me. The merger structure was straightforward, even if the numbers were large. $1.9 billion in acquisition payment, $300 million tied to performance milestones over the next 2 years, $200 million held in escrow during validation. Northbridge Trust and Escrow Services was overseeing the release. Clause 8.2 required continuity from designated technical signatories. I was one of 3. During validation, at least one original architect had to authenticate each cycle. That safeguard wasn't symbolic. It was written into the merger agreement. Arthur was across the room, Accepting congratulations as if the funds had already cleared, our chief financial officer, Daniel, stepped close to him. I drifted nearer, not intending to listen, but close enough to hear. We're still inside the validation window. Daniel told him quietly, "We shouldn't trigger any personnel changes tonight." Arthur gave a short smile. "Relax, the system's stable." "It's stable because she's running validation," Daniel replied, nodding toward me. "Let's not complicate that." Arthur glanced over at me and then back at the guests. "No one's changing anything." He meant it at the time. I believed that. Still, I noticed how quickly he dismissed the reminder. I've worked long enough to know when structure becomes inconvenient. My tablet vibrated with the next checkpoint alert. Authentication in less than an hour. I adjusted the hardware key on my wrist and stepped away from the crowd. The deal wasn't closed yet, no matter how it looked from across the room. I was reviewing the migration log when Isabella Hartwell stepped into my line of sight. She was holding an empty wine glass and wearing the kind of smile that looks pleasant from a distance, but tight up close. "Red, please," she told me, extending the glass. "Private reserve and not warm." I didn't look up immediately. "I'm finalizing a migration validation cycle. Please give me 2 minutes." Her hand stayed suspended between us. "Excuse me, I don't work for catering," I added, keeping my voice steady. "This can't wait." A few of the buyer's executives' spouses were standing behind her. I recognized one from earlier introductions. They were watching closely. Not the way guests watch staff, but the way people watch status being negotiated. Isabella's expression shifted. "Do you know who I am? I know we're still inside the validation window." I replied, "That's what matters right now." The sound came before the sensation registered. A sharp crack against my cheek. My tablet tilted in my hand, and I tightened my grip before it slipped. The room went quiet. Not a soft hush, but a full stop. I noticed a phone lifted at the edge of the crowd. That was the atmosphere. When Isabella Vance approached me, Arthur reached us within seconds. "What's going on?" She refused a simple request. Isabella answered, her voice controlled but shaking. In front of everyone. Daniel, our chief financial officer, leaned toward Arthur. "We should step aside," he murmured. "We're still in validation." Arthur's eyes moved from my face to the guests watching us. "Is this true?" I told her I was completing a migration cycle. I answered, "We're less than an hour from authentication." Arthur's jaw tightened. "This isn't the place for attitude, but this isn't the time for interruptions," I replied. He turned slightly toward Daniel, then back to the room. I saw the calculation. Reputation in front of investors, control in front of his wife. He chose quickly. Arthur didn't raise his voice. That would have looked unstable. He kept it measured, almost reasonable. "This behavior isn't acceptable, he told me by ski. You're done here." Daniel stepped forward. "Arthur, we're still inside the validation window." Arthur didn't look at him. "Security," he called. Without breaking eye contact with me, "Escort her out." I held his gaze. "You're terminating me during an active continuity cycle." "I'm protecting this company's reputation," he replied. "Your access will be revoked immediately." I nodded once. "Then document it properly." He pulled out his phone. I watched him type. The message went to Human Resources with one instruction, effective immediately, within minutes. My tablet displayed the first sign. Authentication privileges suspended. My secure access portal closed without warning. HR had moved fast. Daniel checked his own phone and swore under his breath. The terminations already logged in the system. That mattered. Termination in HR triggered our identity system to revoke my access, and the compliance monitor flagged that a designated signatory was no longer active, which then notified Northbridge Trust and Escrow Services. Any change to designated signatories during the 48-hour validation window triggered an alert. Arthur slipped his phone back into his pocket. "Replace her credentials and move forward." "It's not that simple," Daniel answered quietly. An email notification appeared on Daniel's screen. He showed it to Arthur without speaking. "From Northbridge Trust and Escrow Services, please confirm continuity plan for key technical signatory per clause 8.2. Arthur's jaw tightened. "It's procedural." "It's not," Daniel responded. Arthur dismissed him with a glance. "We'll respond in the morning." Security waited beside me. I removed my hardware key and placed it in my bag before they could ask. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. As I walked out, I understood something clearly. He hadn't just removed me from the room. He had changed the system's understanding of who was authorized to protect the deal. I was halfway across the Longfellow Bridge when the first validation cycle came due. I had already lost remote access, so I couldn't see the internal dashboard, but I knew the timing. Every 4 hours during the 48-hour window, the system required authentication from 2 of the 3 designated signatories. During validation, one of those had to be the original architect. At 9:53 that night, my phone vibrated with a news alert instead of a system ping. Continuity risk flagged at Hartwell Technologies. That meant the cycle had failed. Later, I learned how it unfolded inside the command center. Her credentials are revoked. One of the senior engineers, Marcus Lynn, told Arthur. Marcus had worked under me for 6 years. He wasn't inexperienced. We can authenticate with Daniel, but the validation clause requires 1 original architect during the window. Then promote someone, Arthur replied. It doesn't work like that, Marcus said evenly. Successors have to be pre-approved and registered with escrow before activation. We didn't file one, Daniel added. Clause 8.2 is explicit. Removal without continuity plan triggers review. Arthur's response was a desperate override it, but he was shouting at a black box. Northbridge was the escrow agent and monitoring administrator. It didn't take orders from the CEO, it followed the agreement and the logged certifications. Every attempted override created an incident log. Those logs were summarized by the monitoring administrator and routed to counsel, then into the buyer's breach assessment. Marcus shook his head. The multi-signature structure is locked to the escrow monitor during validation. We can't bypass it without invalidating the entire integrity chain. At 10:11, Northbridge Trust and Escrow Services issued a continuity risk notice. The language was formal, not emotional. A 24-hour cure window had begun. If continuity wasn't restored, the escrow release would be suspended. Arthur dismissed it as administrative noise. When I reached my apartment in Cambridge, I placed my hardware key on the kitchen counter and sat down. I wasn't angry yet. I was aware. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was responding to exactly what had been entered into it. The second authentication cycle was already counting down. By midnight, the video had moved beyond social media. A clip from the gala appeared on a financial news site with a headline about executive conduct during pending merger. The article didn't speculate, but it didn't need to. The image was clear enough. At 12:30, Daniel called me, but I'm not calling officially, he began. Buyer's legal team is requesting clarification about the incident. About the slap, I asked. About governance, when he replied, they're concerned about executive interference during validation. That's reasonable. I answered. There was a pause. Northbridge contacted corporate counsel directly. They want confirmation of the continuity plan. You don't have one, I said. We could reinstate you temporarily, Daniel offered, but it would require Arthur's approval. And formal notice to escrow, I added, plus written acknowledgement from the buyer. He exhaled slowly. He thinks responding now would signal weakness. That decision already signaled something, I said. He didn't argue. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and pulled up the public merger filing. Clause 8.2 was clear. Removal of a key signatory without approved succession during validation triggered review. Cure required restoration of continuity or mutual agreement between parties. I wasn't trying to make a point. If they reinstated me through the proper channels, I would authenticate. I had no interest in watching the system fail. At 1:15 in the morning, another news alert appeared. The buyer had issued a brief statement. We are assessing recent governance developments. The second authentication cycle was less than 4 hours away. My phone remained silent. I made tea and sat at the table, aware that the absence of a call was becoming its own decision. At 5:17 in the morning, the second authentication cycle failed. I didn't need internal access to know it. My phone lit up with a formal notification from Northbridge Trust and Escrow Services validation continuity unresolved. Escrow release suspended pending cure. That was the moment the funds were frozen, not lost, not erased, suspended. 2 minutes later, Arthur called. I let it ring once before answering. Lillian, he began, voice tight but controlled. We need you to authenticate immediately, but I can't. I replied, of course you can, like this is procedural. It stopped being procedural when you terminated me. There was a brief silence. I could hear voices in the background, low and urgent. We'll reinstate your access, he continued. Just log in and complete the cycle. That isn't how the clause works. I said, you removed a key signatory outside protocol. My authorization was revoked when termination was logged in the compliance system. We'll reverse the termination. You can't reverse escrow monitoring retroactively. Restoration requires formal board approval and written acknowledgement from the buyer. You don't have either. His tone hardened. Are you refusing to help the company? I'm explaining the process you triggered. Another voice came onto the line. Daniel, the buyer's counsel is on standby, he said. If we can show continuity before market open, they may reconsider. They already received the suspension notice. I answered. And the governance incident is public? Arthur cut in. This doesn't need to escalate. It already has, I said quietly. There was movement on the other end, muted conversation, then Daniel again. They're invoking the walkaway clause, he said. Effective immediately. I closed my eyes briefly. The buyer cited governance instability, operational continuity risk, and the public conduct incident as material concerns, with validation unresolved inside the cure window. They exercised their right to withdraw. Arthur returned to the line. You're making a mistake. No, I said. You did. I ended the call. At 5:29, a final email arrived from Northbridge confirming suspension of the $2.4 billion transaction pending formal termination of the merger agreement. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. Inside the company, authority was beginning to thin. A pre-market statement hit the wires at 7 a.m. And the company followed with an 8K filing shortly after, disclosing the failed validation and the buyer's withdrawal. When the opening bell rang at 9:30, the stock didn't just dip, it cratered. We were down 18% in the first 4 minutes because the market realized the growth everyone priced in was tied to a deal that no longer existed. Trading volume is already double normal, I replied, watching the price adjust in real time. The buyer issued their formal withdrawal notice, and he continued. They cited governance instability, operational continuity risk, and reputational exposure. That aligns with the clause. I said, it does, he admitted. Within the hour, the breakdown became public. The $1.9 billion acquisition payment was voided. The $300 million performance earnout disappeared with the deal. The $200 million escrow holdback was released back to the buyer. The merger agreement shifted into its remedies section. Whether a termination fee applied depended on fault, and counsel would fight that line for weeks. Arthur didn't call me this time. Instead, Daniel relayed what he could. He keeps asking where the money went, Daniel said quietly. It didn't go anywhere, I answered. It returned to where it was contractually protected. That's not how it feels inside the building. I believed him. Loss rarely feels procedural. By 10:15, one of the company's lenders issued a covenant review notice. That wasn't panic. It was standard risk assessment when a material transaction failed. Still, it carried weight. Daniel hesitated before ending the call. He thought this would pass by morning. It didn't, I said. I set my phone down and closed the market window. The numbers weren't personal, but the consequences were, and the transaction hadn't collapsed because the system broke. It collapsed because trust withdrew. And once that happens, the structure shifts in ways that are hard to reverse. The first week after the collapse moved slower than the market had. Public statements were cautious. Internal conversations were not. Daniel called me on the third day. The board formed a special committee. He told me, independent directors only. That was inevitable. I replied, Arthur's on administrative leave pending investigation. I let that sit for a moment. Administrative leave wasn't a dismissal. It was distance. He thinks this is temporary. Daniel added. It might be, I said, if the investigation supports him. Daniel didn't respond to that, and by the end of the first month, a shareholder derivative lawsuit had been filed. The claim alleged breach of fiduciary duty tied to executive conduct and the termination decision during the validation window. It wasn't dramatic language, like it was procedural, careful, and specific. Arthur called me once during that period. His tone was controlled. You could clarify publicly that you weren't sabotaging anything, he began. I never suggested I was. I answered, a statement from you would help. I won't frame governance failure as misunderstanding. He went quiet, then ended the call. 3 months in, restructuring began. To stabilize lender confidence, equity was reissued. Arthur's ownership stake diluted significantly. He remained a founder, but not in control. Isabella faced separate consequences. A civil complaint for assault was filed by counsel on my behalf. That case moved forward quietly. Invitations stopped arriving for her. Boston's financial circles don't like volatility. None of it happened overnight. There were no headlines announcing collapse of a dynasty. It was slower than that. Authority thinned, influence narrowed. Meetings happened without him. From the outside, but the company still stood. Inside, the center had shifted. 6 months later, I signed the lease on a modest office in Kendall Square. Marcus joined me 2 weeks after that. He walked in on the first morning, set his laptop down, and then looked at me carefully. "You're sure you don't want to go back?" he asked. "They offered," I replied. Interim leadership floated the idea. Advisory role, good compensation. I don't need compensation from a structure that didn't protect itself. I said, "We'll build something cleaner." He nodded once. That was enough. We named the firm Hartwell Governance Systems, not cybersecurity in the dramatic sense. Governance architecture, escrow compliance, continuity planning, the work companies ignore until it's too late. Daniel called once before year end. He's selling the Beacon Hill townhouse. He told me that restructuring pressure. I said, "He thinks you wanted this outcome. I wanted protocol respected." I answered. The rest followed. There was silence on the line. Then a quiet acknowledgement before he hung up. I don't feel victorious. I feel clearer. That night at the gala, when the CEO's entitled wife slapped me in front of investors and cameras, I didn't react. When her husband had me escorted out and fired on the spot, I didn't retaliate. By morning, $2.4 billion was gone, not stolen. Not sabotaged, but withdrawn because structure had been violated. If there's anything this experience taught me, that it's that integrity isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It holds. Systems reflect leadership. Contracts reflect values. When those are compromised, numbers follow. If this story resonates with you, share your thoughts. Leave a comment about a time structure mattered more than ego. And if you value conversations about leadership and accountability, consider subscribing so we can continue them. Power isn't emotional, it's structural. And when you remove the structure, everything above it collapses.